Tonight belongs to me. Everything you see. I built it from nothing. Don't let him get to you.
I won't.
Ishreddus. 4 years, and I still can't figure out what you actually do.
Capital allocation. Risk management.
A fancy phrase for having no real job.
Dad, enough.
She brings nothing to this family. Nothing to this table. Nothing.
Are you certain about that?
Worthless trash. You'll never deserve the Winslow name.
He stood at the head of that table like a man who had already won everything. That night was his victory, his proof that the empire he built was untouchable. He did not see the woman sitting across from him, the one who had quietly kept his empire standing for the past 2 years. I did not correct him. I did not raise my voice. I walked out and made one phone call. By midnight, every dollar I had placed beneath his empire was gone. The only question was how long before he realized what that truly meant. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who didn't bother to look closely enough, this story is for you. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you're here when the truth finally comes out. I have never been the kind of person who announces herself when she walks into a room. That is not modesty, it is a choice I made early, when I understood that people who talk the loudest about what they own tend to be the most frightened of losing it. I built Cobalt Gate Investments from a rented office barely large enough to hold a desk and 2 chairs, over the 3 years after I left my position at a regional investment bank. The firm now manages just over $80 million across private equity placements and structured credit. Most people in my industry know the fund by name. Almost none of them know my name is attached to it. When I married Nathaniel Winslow, I made a decision to keep those 2 worlds separate. It was not difficult. He knew I worked in private portfolio management. He knew I was careful with money and precise in my thinking. He never pressed for details, and I never offered them. In the early months, that separation was about self-protection. I had watched too many relationships quietly reorganize themselves around one person's net worth, and I did not want to become someone's financial landscape. I wanted to be a person. Nathaniel treated me like one, and that was enough. What I did not anticipate was Preston. Preston Winslow had built his reputation the way some men build walls loudly, brick by brick, making sure everyone nearby could hear the effort. Winslow Legacy Properties developed commercial real estate across street. Louis and the surrounding region, specializing in the restoration of historic structures. Preston was proud of that work, and the pride was not entirely unearned. He had built something real. The problem was that he had decided the building of it made him qualified to measure every other person's worth against his own, and he had been doing that for so long that he no longer noticed he was doing it. From the first year of our marriage, Preston made clear he did not think Nathaniel had chosen well. He never said it plainly in front of me that would have required a kind of directness he preferred to avoid. Instead, he said it to Nathaniel in conversations I was not supposed to overhear, and to his business associates in the form of jokes that were not quite jokes. Nathaniel would come home quieter on the evenings he had spent with his father, and I would not ask why, because I already knew. What neither of them knew was that 2 years before that dinner party, I had saved Preston's company. I discovered the problem during a routine review of regional credit markets. Winslow Legacy Properties had overextended itself across 3 simultaneous development projects, and the debt structure was fragile in ways that were not visible from the outside. 2 of the firm's primary lenders had quietly flagged the account. Preston had been moving capital between subsidiaries to paper over the shortfall, but the math was not going to hold past the next quarter. Without a significant capital injection, the company was looking at covenant violations, forced asset sales, and possibly insolvency before the end of the year. I sat with that information for 4 days. I thought about Nathaniel, who had given years of his life to that company and believed in what it could become. I thought about the several hundred people employed by the firm project managers, site supervisors, administrative staff, contractors, none of whom had made the financial decisions that were about to end their livelihoods. I thought about what it would mean to do nothing, and I found I could not sit with that answer. I structured the investment through a private vehicle registered under the name Cobalt Strategic Holdings. It was clean, arm's length, and entirely legitimate. The terms were market rate, the documentation was thorough, and there was no mention of my name anywhere in the filing. Over the following 24 months, I provided $28 million in staged capital, renegotiated 2 of the firm's loan covenants through intermediaries, and helped position the company to win the development rights for a project called the Bellwether Quarter, a large-scale rehabilitation of a decommissioned warehouse district in South Street, Louis, to be converted into hotel, office, and retail space. It was the most ambitious thing Preston had ever attempted, and it was only possible because I had quietly made it so. Preston spoke about his mystery investor often. He described the person as someone with exceptional instincts, someone who understood real value when the market couldn't see it yet. He was telling a version of that story the night he called me worthless trash. The party at the Winslow estate was a celebration. The city had granted final approval for the last development phase of the Bellwether Quarter that afternoon, and Preston had assembled every person whose opinion he valued in one room: directors, attorneys, contractors, 2 senior officers from the bank holding the primary construction loan. The house was full and loud and warm, with the particular energy of people who believe they are in the presence of a winner. I sat beside Nathaniel and watched Preston work the room. He was good at it. He moved from guest to guest with the ease of a man who had spent decades practicing the specific performance of confidence, and the guests responded the way guests always do when they sense the host needs to be admired. I did not find it contemptible. I found it a little sad, the way most performances are sad when you can see the effort underneath. The trouble started when one of the bank officers asked me directly what I did for work. I told him I worked in capital allocation and risk management, which is accurate, and which I have learned is usually enough to satisfy the question without opening a longer conversation. Preston laughed from across the table. Not a quiet laugh, a laugh designed to be heard. He said that was a very sophisticated way of describing the absence of a real job. Several people smiled. Nathaniel reached for his wine glass and said nothing. I looked at Preston and told him I was being precise, not sophisticated, and that there was a difference. That should have been the end of it. Preston was not in the habit of letting things end before he was ready. He told the table that Nathaniel was a remarkable man who had built a genuine career and was positioned to lead one of the most significant real estate firms in the region. He said this as a compliment to his son, but the architecture of the statement was designed to leave me standing in negative space, the place where a more suitable wife would have been. He said I had never contributed anything of substance to the Winslow family. He said I did not understand what it meant to build something that lasts. Nathaniel set down his glass and started to speak. Preston talked over him. There was a particular kind of ugliness in what came next, not because it was unusual for Preston to think those things, but because he chose to say them with an audience. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the people at that table to understand exactly where I stood in his estimation. And he wanted Nathaniel to hear it spoken plainly in public so that the cost of disagreeing would feel too high. That was the calculation. I could see it clearly, and I think some part of Nathaniel could too, which is why he did not finish the sentence he had started. Preston brought his hand down on the table and called me worthless trash. He said I would never deserve to carry the Winslow name. The room went very quiet. Not the uncertain quiet of people who do not know what has happened, but the deliberate quiet of people who have decided the safest thing is to pretend they are somewhere else. The man from the bank found something interesting to examine on his plate. 2 of the contractors shifted in their chairs and looked toward the window. Nathaniel was standing, but he was not speaking, and the distance between those 2 things was wider than anything else in the room. I looked at Helena. She had not looked away. She was watching me with an expression I did not have a name for in that moment. Not pity, not apology exactly, but something that carried the weight of a long history she had never been able to speak out loud. I held her gaze for a moment, and then I folded my napkin and set it beside my plate. I thanked Preston for making his position clear, and I left the table. I walked through the foyer of the estate and out through the front door, and I stood on the stone steps overlooking the Missouri River in the November dark. I called Martin Holloway. Martin is my legal counsel and the only person outside of my immediate operational team who knows the full structure of Cobalt Gate. He answered on the second ring. I told him to activate the investor protection clause in the Cobalt Strategic Holdings Agreement with Winslow Legacy Properties. I told him to freeze the final disbursement of $11 million that had been scheduled for the following week, and to send formal notice terminating the company's access to the $9 million standby credit facility. Martin told me that if the disbursement was frozen, the bellwether quarter would likely stop moving within 30 to 60 days. He told me that Preston had used nearly the entire real estate portfolio as collateral against the construction loans, and that without the incoming capital, the company would breach at least 3 loan covenants before the end of the month. He needed to make sure I understood what I was setting in motion. I told him I understood. I also told him I wanted him to simultaneously begin preparing a contingency structure, a ring-fenced reserve that could be used to protect worker wages and outstanding contractor payments if the company reached insolvency. Those were 2 separate instructions, and I was clear that one did not cancel the other. Martin said he would have the notices ready before midnight. I stood on those steps for a long time after I ended the call. The lights of the city were visible across the river, and the air was cold enough to make the thinking feel clearer than it had inside. I had told myself that the investments were about Nathaniel, about the workers, about the principle of not watching preventable harm happen when you have the means to prevent it. All of that was true. What I had not fully admitted to myself was that I had also been funding the comfort of a man who had spent 4 years making me feel like I owed the room an explanation for existing in it. I had been doing that quietly, without asking for acknowledgement, telling myself it did not matter whether he respected me. The night air made that story harder to hold on to. I was not angry in the way people expect anger to look loud, immediate, pointed. What I felt was something quieter and more permanent, the particular stillness that comes when you finally stop pretending something is acceptable. I had been invisible in that house for 4 years by design. I had made myself invisible, and the man who had benefited most from my invisibility had just stood up in front of his most important guests and used it against me. I was done making myself small enough to fit inside someone else's idea of what I was worth. Nathaniel came home at 7 the following morning. I heard his car in the driveway and stayed at the kitchen table, both hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. I had not slept. Not because I was distressed, but because there was too much clarity in the dark and I had not wanted to lose it before I had time to examine it fully. He walked in still wearing the clothes from the night before. He had left the party not long after I did, according to the single text he had sent me around midnight, but he had not come home. I did not ask where he had been. What he said next told me more than any answer would have. He said the lawyers from Cobalt Strategic Holdings had contacted Winslow Legacy Properties first thing that morning. They had sent formal notice terminating the standby credit facility and freezing the pending disbursement. His father's financial officer was already on the phone with the bank. Everyone was asking the same question: who was Cobalt Strategic Holdings, and why had they pulled out overnight? Nathaniel looked at me across the kitchen and asked if I knew anything about it. I set down the coffee cup and went to the study. I came back with a folder and placed it on the table in front of him. Inside was the Certificate of Incorporation for Cobalt Gate Investments, the ownership structure showing my name as sole principal, and the transaction history for every capital movement made through Cobalt Strategic Holdings over the past 24 months. $28 million, dispersed in 7 stages, each one documented with my signature on the approval. He read it the way people read things they are hoping will resolve into something other than what they appear to be. When he reached the final page, he set it down without speaking. He asked why I had never told him. I said that when we first met, I needed to know he was with me and not with what I owned. That by the time I was certain of the answer, the privacy had become something I valued for its own sake. I was not performing modesty or testing him. I simply did not build Cobalt Gate to be someone's credential. It was mine, and I had kept it that way. When I found out what was happening to his father's company, I made the investment because I did not want Nathaniel to lose the career he had built there, and because 300 people who had nothing to do with Preston's financial decisions did not deserve to lose their livelihoods because of them. Nathaniel was quiet for a while. Then he asked me to restore the funding. He said his father was wrong. He said what happened at the dinner table was inexcusable and he was not going to pretend otherwise. But he said there were people who would be hurt by a construction halt, subcontractors already on site, vendors with open purchase orders, employees who lived paycheck to paycheck. Those people had not called me worthless trash, and they should not bear the cost of the man who did. I told him he was right about that, and that I had already instructed Martin to prepare a contingency structure to protect worker wages and contractor payments if it came to that. But I was not going to restore the funding as if the previous evening had not happened. And before we went any further, I needed him to answer one question honestly. I asked him, if last night I had been exactly what his father believed me to be, a woman with no firm, no assets, no leverage, would he still be sitting here telling me that what Preston did was inexcusable? Or would the word he used be something softer, something more manageable, something that left more room for the family dinner next month to go on as planned? Nathaniel did not answer right away. He looked at the folder on the table rather than at me, and the silence between us held the weight of everything he had not said the night before, the moment he had stood up but not spoken, the sentence he had started and not finished while Preston's voice filled the room. He was a good man. I had always believed that. But goodness without courage is only potential, and potential had not been enough for me last night. He was still working out who he wanted to be when Preston arrived at the offices of Cobalt Gate Investments. I found out later that Preston had spent the morning making calls, trying to identify the principals behind Cobalt Strategic Holdings through his network of attorneys and banking contacts. He had not found my name. The structure was clean and the intermediaries were professionals, but he had found the registered address of the parent entity, which led him to the Hawthorne Exchange Building in downtown St. Louis. He showed up in the lobby with Nathaniel, who had not warned me they were coming, and demanded to see whoever was in charge. Martin called me from the elevator. By the time they stepped into the conference room on the top floor, I was already seated at the head of the table, with Martin to my left and two members of my operations team at the far end. The room had floor-to-ceiling windows and a clear view of the river. I had worked in that office for 6 years. I knew exactly how it looked to someone walking in for the first time. Preston stopped just inside the door. He looked at me, then at the room, then back at me. He said this was not funny. He asked to speak to the actual owner of the company. I told Martin to bring up the incorporation documents on the screen behind me. For the next several minutes, I walked Preston through what he was looking at. The founding registration, the ownership records, the approval signatures on every capital disbursement made to Winslow Legacy Properties across 24 months, each one in my handwriting, each one time-stamped and notarized. There was no mysterious investor with exceptional instincts who had seen something in him that the market had missed. There was only me. The woman he had called worthless trash 12 hours earlier in front of the people whose respect he most wanted to keep. I told him I had covered the payroll shortfall in the third quarter of the year before last, when his accounts ran dry before the River District project closed. I told him I had sent representatives to negotiate with First Central Bank when they were 48 hours from issuing a formal default notice on his construction loan. I told him the development rights for the Bellwether Quarter, the project he had celebrated last night as his greatest achievement, existed because the capital I provided had made the company creditworthy enough to compete for them. Preston told me I had engineered this deliberately, that I had hidden my identity to set a trap, to position myself to humiliate him exactly as he had humiliated me. I said that if I had wanted to humiliate him, I would have introduced myself correctly at the first family dinner 4 years ago and let him spend the last 24 months knowing who was keeping his company solvent. I did not do that. I kept my name out of it because I do not need Preston Winslow to know what I am capable of in order for me to know it myself. The problem was that he had spent 4 years filling in the blank of what I was with, whatever served his image of the family, and last night he had decided to say it out loud in a room full of witnesses. I informed him that the $11 million disbursement was permanently canceled. The $9 million credit facility had been formally terminated. $20 million he had been counting on to carry the Bellwether Quarter through its final construction phase no longer existed. Preston left without another word. Nathaniel stayed behind. He looked at the table and said he did not know what to say. I told him that was all right. I was not asking him to say anything right now. What followed was ugly in the methodical way that financial unraveling tends to be. Preston contacted his attorneys and issued a formal complaint to the city council, alleging that Cobalt Strategic Holdings had used insider access to manipulate the capital structure of Winslow Legacy Properties and was now engineering an artificial crisis to acquire the assets at distressed prices. It was the kind of accusation designed to create delay and confusion rather than to actually hold up under scrutiny. Martin addressed it point by point. Every transaction had been conducted at arm's length through independent legal entities. Every term had been market standard. The termination clause Preston was now calling predatory was language his own attorneys had reviewed and signed. What the investigation did surface was something that had nothing to do with me. Preston had been moving money between subsidiary accounts without properly reporting the transfers to Cobalt Strategic Holdings as a material investor, which was itself a violation of the agreement's disclosure requirements. The covenant breach was not caused by my withdrawal. My withdrawal simply removed the buffer that had been concealing it. The picture that emerged over the following days was of a company that had grown faster than its foundations could support. Preston had taken on too much debt, secured it against too many assets simultaneously, and used each new capital raise to paper over gaps in the last one. The bellwether quarter was not the crown of a healthy empire. It was the final bet of a man who had been running out of road for longer than anyone outside the firm had been allowed to see. Construction on the site stopped. The bank froze the primary operating account pending a covenant review. Subcontractors began calling the project manager's office asking when work would resume. Employees started talking among themselves in the way that people do when they can feel something shifting beneath them, and no one in charge is saying anything useful. Nathaniel went to his father and told him plainly what needed to happen. He said Preston had to step back from operational control long enough for the company to bring in independent restructuring counsel, and that the regulatory complaint had to be withdrawn immediately. He said that was the only path that kept the firm viable, and that the alternative was watching every asset Preston had spent 30 years building go to creditors one by one. Preston told his son that conceding to his daughter-in-law would cost him the only thing he had left to lose, which was the appearance of being the kind of man who did not concede. He said no. That was the moment Nathaniel made his decision. Not out of anger, I believe he had already moved past anger into something more settled and deliberate. He resigned from Winslow Legacy Properties that afternoon and came to my office on the top floor of the Hawthorne Exchange. He sat down across from me and said that his father was wrong and he was done operating as though the cost of saying so was too high. He said he understood that what he was doing now was not the same as what he should have done the night of the dinner party, and he was not asking me to treat them as equivalent. He just wanted me to know that whatever came next, he was not going to stand on the wrong side of it again. I appreciated that he did not ask me for anything when he said it. 3 days after Nathaniel's resignation, the bank issued its formal notice. Winslow Legacy Properties had breached 4 loan covenants. Unless the company could secure $20 million within 72 hours, the bank would begin the process of seizing collateralized assets. The board of directors called an emergency session that same evening. With Preston still refusing to acknowledge the scale of what he had done, the board voted to remove him from the position of chief executive, effective immediately. The company Preston had built over 30 years now sat in the hands of people deciding whether it could be saved and whether there was anyone willing to save it. That decision was mine to make. The 72 hours the bank had set was not designed to create solutions. It was designed to create pressure, and pressure at that scale reveals exactly who people are when the performance of confidence is no longer sustainable. I watched it work across those 3 days, the calls to former partners who suddenly had scheduling conflicts, the attorneys who began hedging their language, the board members who had attended Preston's dinner parties for years and now communicated exclusively through intermediaries. Martin came to my office on the morning after the board vote with a full summary of where things stood. He laid it out without editorializing, which is one of the things I trust most about him. The construction site had been shut down for 5 days. 47 subcontractors had open contracts with outstanding invoices totaling just over $3 million. The payroll cycle for Winslow Legacy Properties' full-time staff was due in 11 days. If the bank moved to seize the primary collateral assets, those employees would likely not receive that payment, and the legal process of recovering anything through bankruptcy proceedings could take months. I had already known most of that. I had asked Martin to model it before I made the call from the estate steps, which is why I had given him the parallel instruction about the contingency structure. But sitting with numbers in the abstract is different from sitting with them when the clock is running. The question was not whether I had the means to act. The question was what acting should look like, and whether there was a version of it that did not require me to hand back power to a man who had not earned the right to hold it. Nathaniel did not pressure me. He had come to my office the day after his resignation and said what he needed to say, and since then he had been careful to take up only the space I offered him. On the second evening, he told me he had been thinking about the question I asked him at the kitchen table, whether he would have found the same words if I had nothing behind me, and that the honest answer was that he did not know, and that not knowing was the part he was most ashamed of. He said a man should not need his wife to be worth $80 million before he decides she is worth defending. I told him I appreciated that he said it without asking me what it meant for us. We would get to that. There were more immediate things to attend to first. Preston came to see me on the morning the deadline expired. He called Martin and asked if I would meet him somewhere neutral. I agreed to the lobby cafe of the Hawthorne Exchange building, which was as neutral as anywhere and had the advantage of being mine. He arrived looking like a man who had not slept properly in days. He said he owed me an apology. He said what he had said at the dinner was wrong, and that he had known it before the words finished leaving his mouth. I let him continue because I have learned that the content of an apology tells you more than the apology itself. Over the next 15 minutes, Preston talked about the company, the board vote, the bank's asset seizure process, the contractors, the project timeline, and his reputation in the industry. He talked about all of it with genuine distress, and I did not doubt the feeling was real. But at no point in those 15 minutes did he ask about the people whose names were on the payroll. He did not ask about the subcontractors who had mobilized their crews based on contracts his company had signed. He did not ask whether the men and women who had shown up to his job sites every morning for years had somewhere else to go. Everything he said organized itself around what he stood to lose, and nothing organized itself around what he had cost anyone else. When he finished, I asked him how many of his non-management employees he could name. Not the directors, the people who arrived at the sites before anyone else and left after everyone had gone. He looked at me without speaking. I asked whether he had ever thought about the company as a collection of people rather than a collection of assets. He looked at the table between us. He could not answer, and we both understood what that meant. I told him I would not be restoring the investment under any terms that returned operational control to him. That was not a negotiating position. The board had already removed him, and I had no intention of reversing that outcome. What I was willing to do was something different, and I told him clearly so there would be no confusion about my reasons. Cobalt Gate Investments would purchase the outstanding debt from the bank at current market value. We would assume the construction financing for the Bellwether Quarter and provide the capital needed to complete it under a restructured development agreement. Every subcontractor with an open invoice would be paid in full within 5 business days. The payroll fund would be protected through the transition period, regardless of how long the restructuring took. Preston would accept a permanent restriction on any involvement in the company's governance or operations. In exchange, he would receive a structured settlement sufficient to maintain a reasonable standard of living, drawn from the liquidation of non-core assets. He would not lose everything. He would lose the company. Preston sat across from me and said nothing for a long time. I think he had believed, at some level, that I would not actually let it come to this, that family, or self-interest, or some residual need for his approval would pull me back from the decision I had already made. He had underestimated me for 4 years. He was still doing it, right up until the moment it became impossible. He signed the agreement before the deadline ran out. Martin's team worked through the night. By the following morning, Cobalt Gate had formally acquired the debt position. The construction financing was reinstated under the new agreement. The subcontractor invoices were processed and queued for payment. The payroll fund was established as a ring-fenced account outside the reach of any further corporate restructuring. The people who had built what Preston called his empire would be paid. That had never been in question for me. It was the one part of this I had decided before anything else. The company was renamed before the restructuring paperwork was finalized. Bellwether Community Development replaced Winslow Legacy Properties on the letterhead, the site signage, and the legal registrations. There was no ceremony around the change. It was simply done, the way most necessary things are done, quietly, correctly, without requiring anyone to make a speech about it. Nathaniel received a call from the incoming independent director asking whether he would be willing to return to the company in an operational capacity. The offer made clear it was not a restoration of his prior title. He would come in under the oversight of the independent board and be evaluated the same way any senior hire would be evaluated. He called me after he got off the phone and asked what I thought. I told him that was entirely his decision, and that whatever he chose, I hoped he was choosing it because of what he wanted to build, and not because of what he felt he owed anyone. He said he understood the difference, and I believed him. He accepted the offer. Helena called me 3 weeks later. She was calling from an apartment in the central West End neighborhood of Street Louis, which she told me she had leased the week after the board vote. She said she had been looking at apartments on and off for 2 years, but had always found a reason to stay. She did not elaborate on what had finally changed, and I did not ask. She said she was sorry she had not spoken at the dinner table, and that she had been sorry for longer than just that evening. I told her I knew, and that the look she had given me across the room that night had meant more than she probably realized. She said she hoped we could have coffee sometime. I told her I would like that. Nathaniel and I did not have a single conversation that resolved everything between us. That is not how it works when something real has been damaged. There is no single exchange that settles the account. What we had instead was a series of smaller conversations over the weeks that followed, each one a little more honest than the one before, each one requiring both of us to say things that were harder than the version that came before. I told him that I could continue in this marriage and that I wanted to. But I also told him I needed him to understand what I meant when I said I needed him to stand beside me when it cost something, not when the cost was already acceptable, not when he had calculated that the family would forgive him, but specifically when it was uncertain and when the easier thing was silence. He said he understood. I told him understanding and doing were not the same thing, and that I was not issuing a warning. I was telling him what I needed so he would know clearly and could decide whether he could offer it. He said he could. I chose to believe him, which is always a choice, and is different from certainty, and is the only honest foundation for anything that continues. The Bellwether Quarter opened 12 months after the restructuring was finalized. The ceremony was held on a Saturday morning in early autumn, and the weather was the kind that makes Street Louis look like somewhere it rarely is clear and cool and generous with its light. The converted warehouse complex filled nearly 4 city blocks. The hotel occupied the North Tower, the office floors ran through the center building, and the retail and community spaces occupied the south end along the river path. The Community Development Board had partnered with 3 neighborhood organizations on the retail leasing to prioritize local businesses. It was, by any reasonable measure, a remarkable piece of work. I stood on the rooftop terrace of the central building and looked out over all of it. A project that had nearly dissolved into a creditor's dispute was now open to the public, creating several hundred permanent jobs and returning a section of the riverfront that had been inaccessible to the city for decades. There was a plaque on the main entrance listing the architects, the lead contractors, the construction crews, and the investors who had made the project viable. Preston Winslow's name was not on it. He came to the opening. I noticed him from the terrace, standing at the far edge of the crowd on the ground-level plaza, in a dark coat, watching the ribbon cutting from a distance that made clear he knew he was not there in any official capacity. He was not announced. No one brought him forward. He was simply a man attending a public event for a building he had once believed would carry his name forever. Before the afternoon ended, he made his way to where I was standing near the entrance to the main lobby. He said he had been wrong to call me worthless trash. He said he had said it in front of the people whose opinion he most valued, and that he had spent a year understanding what that cost. I told him that what he said that night had never been about my worth. A person's value is not determined by whether someone else can see it or chooses to acknowledge it. What his words had done was tell me something true about him, something I had suspected but had never heard him confirm so clearly, and in front of so many witnesses. He did not respond to that. He nodded once, and after a moment he turned and walked back through the crowd toward the plaza exit. I watched him go without any particular feeling. Not satisfaction, not pity, not the residual weight of something unresolved. What I felt was the quiet that comes after a long effort has reached its honest conclusion, the stillness that follows when you finally stop carrying something that was never yours to carry in the first place. I had not dismantled Preston's empire. I had simply stopped holding it up. When the invisible support disappeared, what remained was only what he had actually built, and that, in the end, turned out to be less than he had ever allowed himself to know. Nathaniel found me near the lobby entrance as the afternoon crowd began to thin. We walked into the building together without saying much, the way people walk when the silence between them is comfortable rather than careful. The Bellwether Quarter rose around us finished, open, full of people who had no idea what it had cost or what it had almost become. That was fine. It was not built for them to know the story. It was built to stand. The part of this story worth holding on to is not the moment the truth came out. It is the moment Mallory chose to protect people who had nothing to do with the harm done to her when she had every reason to walk away and let everything burn, and she did not. Real strength is not about making someone pay. It is about knowing exactly what you are capable of and choosing carefully how you use it. If that is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe to the channel. There are more worth telling.